Hi, this is Bill Punch from Michigan State University with another video on the topic, the practice of computing using Python, CSE 231. Today we're going to do some odds and ends things about functions. I think we are important for us to pick up, and we'll try to hit them pretty quickly here. Let's go ahead and get started. So here's some things that we haven't covered about functions. This we know about how a function works. Here's an example function. It adds three things together. It has 1, 2, 3 parameters, and when I call it, the first argument is associated with the first parameter, second argument, second parameter, third argument, third parameter. And when I run this, I get exactly what I want. And if I call it with the incorrect number of arguments to parameters, I get an error message. What we'd like to do is provide a way to do two things. We'd like to provide default parameters that if I don't provide an argument, the parameter gets a default argument from the system. If an argument is provided, it takes that argument, but if an argument is not provided, it takes a default. And then on the other side, in the calling process from the invocation, we'd like to be able to say specifically for a named parameter, a parameter with a particular name, we'd like to say this is the value we'd like to pass. So how do we do that? Here's another function. This is the print box function. It takes three parameters, height, width, and length. And now associated with each one of those parameters is an equal and then something on the right-hand side. And the value on the right-hand side is the default. If an argument is not provided by the invocation, then the parameter will take on that default value. Let's go ahead and define that function and try some invocations. Here is the print box function called with no arguments. We'll take all the defaults, and we do indeed get height, width, and length set. No complaints. They take on their default values. The equal sign in the parameter list then indicates the default. In the calling list, we can name the particular parameter that we want to set, as long as the name that we provide is exactly the same as the name of one of the parameters in the functions. So in this particular application, I'm saying I want to call the print box function. I want to set length to 100, and I'm not providing the other arguments. Those parameters will take on default values. And that works. I can even change the order of invocation as long as I name all the parameters. So it's height, width, and length by default up here, but here's length, height, and width. Right? As long as I've named them, that works too. If you want to mix and match required and named parameters, we have to be careful. So what's a required parameter? A required parameter is one that doesn't have any defaults. You have to provide it, and you should provide required parameters first, as we do here. Here's another function. The required parameter is listed first. There's no default. You have to provide it when you make the call. Afterwards, you can use name functions to make this go. So let's go ahead and try this. We get an error because when I called the function, I didn't provide any arguments, and the first parameter is required. If we call it again, I provide one, which will go to the required parameter, and the other two take on defaults, and that will work. So if you're going to mix required and named parameters, do the required first, do the named after. Docstrings. It's a good idea that when we work with our functions, we provide documentation in a way that works well with Python. For example, if I want to know how the list function works in the IPython notebook, I put a question mark behind it, and a pop-up comes up with all kinds of documentation. When I write functions, it would be great if that same thing would happen. The documentation that I provide is available to the programming system that the user is working with. The way we do that is to provide a docstring. The docstring is a string that occurs right after the definition of a function, and that string, and in this particular case it's a triply quoted string so it can occupy multiple lines, is stored as the documentation. So were I to define this function, I could then say, well, what documentation is associated with find name, and that document string is stored in such a way that the system knows and goes and finds it and provides it for the user. As it turns out, when the docstring is provided as that first string, it gets stored in a special place called the _doc_ file. I'll show you that that's in fact where it's stored, but that's how the system can go and find it. The last thing I want to talk about are arbitrary number of arguments. Imagine, for example, that you have to write the print function. How many parameters should you provide? The answer is you can't know. You can go anywhere from no arguments in a print function to as many as you can imagine. How is it that we can deal with an arbitrary number of arguments? Python provides a fairly simple way. Here is a required parameter to this function, average, called nameString. Here's another one called grade tuple, and you'll notice the star in front of that name. The star indicates that for any argument past the required arguments, they will be gathered up in a tuple so that they can be used as the function so chooses. So if I define this function, which simply adds up all the grades after the string and averages them, I can make a call like this: average bill. Bill is the required argument. It's passed first, and then the rest of these are gathered up in a tuple, and all we do then is sum the tuple up and divide by the number of elements in there. So if I call this, it works great. If I call it with 5 arguments, if I call it with 2 arguments, no matter what, grade tuple will collect all those extra arguments up, and I can work with them inside the function.